David Lewis was one of the most prominent metaphysicians of the late 20th century, and his facial hair is as at that time was as unique as his writing style, which is very dense, very concise, very short for someone who is proposing such important ideas. What we're looking at in this video is how things persist over time, how things can continue to exist, especially while changing their properties. And those would be called temporary intrinsics, as we will explain in a moment. So a neutral way of thinking about persistence is that when something exists at various times, it persists. So persist itself is a neutral term, just meaning that something continues to exist over time. A second way that this might occur, and this is more specific to a metaphysical view, is to say that something perdures. This is when something exists at various times by having different temporal parts at various times. So it doesn't exist as a whole at all times, but it just has parts of itself that exist at different times. And then when you have the accumulation of those parts, that's what makes something the object or the person that they are in our normal language. Another way of thinking about this is to say that something endures. When something persists by being fully present at different times, that's endurance. This is analogous to the way a universal exists at different places by being fully present at different places. So you have the color orange in front of you, maybe. It's fully orange. Orange is fully there. But of course, orange also exists elsewhere. That is, if you have a classical view of properties and universals. Now, the analogy for perdurance would be more like a street that exists at various places at different times. So you cross a street at one place, it's going to have very different characteristics than maybe crossing that street at a different place further away. So that would be the analogy for perdurance. Endurance is something we'll look at first. This is not Lewis's view, but when we say that a person or something endures, we are saying that it is fully present at any given time of its existence. Now, we're not talking about having all spatial parts at all times. So if we're talking about a person, for example, this is not ruling out somebody having an amputation. You could endure and be the same person before and after an amputation. We're talking about just being the same person. You're fully there as that person prior to the amputation and after the amputation. Now, if you've followed the metaphysics videos that I've made in the past, there are things called intrinsic properties. Now, Peter van Inwagen described a useful but not a foolproof test for what an intrinsic property is. And his suggestion was that if you have an atom for atom duplicator, the resultant thing would be a duplicate that has all the intrinsic properties duplicated, but not the external or extrinsic properties. So only a few of those, it's not foolproof, only if there are a few external relations, extrinsic properties that would be duplicated. So for example, being near a duplicator would be true of both the original and the duplicate, and being near a duplicator is not an intrinsic property. But that might give you a feel for what intrinsic properties are. I also would say that it might be better to go to Lewis himself in a different source than the one I'm using, his article on temporary intrinsics. Elsewhere, Lewis clarifies what temporary, or rather just intrinsic properties are and he says this: a sentence or a statement or a proposition, and those are different things, but we need not worry about those distinctions here. Sentence, statement, proposition that ascribes intrinsic properties to something is entirely about that thing, whereas an ascription of extrinsic properties to something is not entirely about that thing. So that's his definition of an intrinsic property. Now we need to think about what the problem is when we consider these as being temporary. So Lewis is worried about a problem associated with temporary intrinsic properties. Those intrinsic properties that a thing has at one time, but then lacks at another time. So, for example, when somebody says, that man at the jazz concert who was flicking his lighter is my sociology professor. Well, we presume that the professor who was flicking his lighter at the concert is also then not flicking his lighter in class while teaching class. So that would be a temporary intrinsic. It's something of the man is doing. It's an action he's performing. But it's true at one time, not at another time. Or we might say the lady in red was dancing. So at one point in time, she is dancing. At another point, she does not have the property of dancing. That would be a temporary intrinsic, and maybe even a better example than flicking one's lighter. Another example that would not be a person, but a thing, the tennis ball. It is round when still or being tossed in the air before being served, but it's flattened when it's hit. So tennis ball A here is the one being tossed in the air. That's at T1. And then we call the object B, the ones being flattened at T2. We could identify them as different objects, and Lewis, in fact, will want to do so and take that fairly seriously. Now, professional tennis players, when they serve, will flatten the ball even more than my diagram shows. If you get a slow-mo video or a stop frame video photo of that, it's quite amazing how flat they go. In any case, let's move on to the problem. What kind of problem do we have now with temporary intrinsics? Well, the problem is this, expressed in this question. How is it that one and the same thing can have apparently contradictory properties? So consider the principle of the indiscernibility of identicals, a logical principle that nearly everyone accepts. It's broadly useful in all kinds of fields, in detective work, in archaeology. It's true and applies in all kinds of fields. So what is the principle? The principle is this: if A and B are strictly identical, they are one and the same thing, then A has all the properties that B has, and B has all the properties that A has. In other words, they have all the same properties. So we have our problem here, thinking of the tennis ball when we labeled it before being hit A. A is round, and then during being served, B is flattened. And so that violates the indiscernibility of identicals, says Lewis. So now we have a problem. So is it a different tennis ball? Has it gone out of existence and a different tennis ball come into existence? What's going on here? Well, Lewis has three potential solutions to the problem. The first two are solutions that he rejects. So option number one would be having a shape that's not an intrinsic property after all. That is, having a shape isn't an intrinsic property. What would it be? Well, this solution says having a shape is actually a relational property. It's an external property. It's relating a thing's shape to a time, something distinct from itself. So in itself, the tennis ball has no shape, if we continue to think of that example. It's round before the serve, it's flattened when it's being hit, but all the shapes that it has are related to a particular time. So the roundness is related to T1. So it's not just round, it's round at T1. It's not just flattened, it's flattened at T2. And the bottom line of this solution is there really aren't any temporary intrinsics, right? There are, because you're doing away with intrinsic properties that have changed. Anything that you say is an intrinsic property that something has at one point and lacks at another point, you just relate it to times and you get rid of temporary intrinsic properties entirely. Now, Lewis rejects that view. He thinks objects do have temporary intrinsic properties. So option 2 is considered, and this is the idea that the only intrinsic properties of a thing are those it has at the present moment. Those are the only real ones. So you can't say the ball is both flattened and round. It is round at that moment in time. It is flattened at the next moment in time that is present. But other times, other than the present, are fictions made from the materials of the present. So this is Dean Zimmerman's solution. So I'll have a video on Zimmerman's suggestions here on presentism and how this works. But this solution, at least says Lewis, of course, Zimmerman would object to this, it actually rejects persistence entirely, and thus it even rejects endurance. Now, Zimmerman is going to say, no, he's a proponent of the idea of endurance, but Lewis is saying that doesn't make sense here. In fact, he says, it goes against all that we believe. And no one believes that he has no past. No one believes that he has no future unless he's at the moment of his, just prior to his execution. So in any case, Lewis says, you don't think that way. We think that we existed in the past, that that's true of us. It's not just us now. We can talk about future selves and past selves. So what is Lewis's preferred solution? The preferred solution is to say that the different temporary intrinsics, those properties that are contradictory, actually belong to different things. They belong to different temporal parts of objects. So there is just one tennis ball we can talk about being used through a match, assuming, of course, they wouldn't use the same one through the entire match, but just assume that you have that. And it's just one ball, but it has many, many, many different temporal parts. And so objects perdure. They persist by having different temporal parts at different times. So one tennis ball can exist, but it's a collection of different temporal parts, tennis ball stages, we might say. And in relation to people, we would say the same thing. We perdure, but we persist by having different temporal parts, and we would call those person stages. Now, for Lewis, being a physicalist, he says a person stage is a physical object, just as a person is. And if there were souls, he would allow that there might be person stages that have also soul stages that go along with them. But that brings up more interesting concerns when we're talking about people that are actually composed of various temporal parts. So what we need to do is do another video looking at Lewis's view of person stages and exactly what they are and how they compose when put together an individual person.